instability, memory problems, anxiety for little or no reason, aggression, headaches, tummy aches, learning problems, and also unusual thoughts, unusual behaviors, and unusual religious or sometimes even sexual experiences. When the temporal lobes are too low in activity, so as I said, learning problems, memory problems, often involved in dementias. And we'll talk about that in lesson 12, but frontal temporal lobe dementia, so obviously involves the temporal lobes. Alzheimer's disease early on involves the temporal lobes. So you want to protect this part of the brain. It's involved in some forms of epilepsy and can be involved with aggression, particularly on the left side, even suicidal ideation. The temporal lobes actually sit in an area of the skull called the temporal fossa, or the temporal space. And the problem with that space is on the front part, there's a bone. It's as sharp as a knife. It's called the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And remember, your brain is soft. Your skull is really hard. Your brain was not meant to play football or hit soccer balls with your head. And the front part, the front inside part of the temporal lobes has that little almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. In fact, the amygdala is, I think it's great for almond. And so imagine this sharp bone, boom, boom, boom. So trauma can hurt the amygdala on the inside the hippocampus. So emotional reactiveness, memory, and brain trauma just so commonly involves damage to these very important structures of the temporal lobe. Now, sometimes when the area works too hard, people can have seizures. They can be irritable when it works too hard. Sometimes people have these feelings of panic for little or no reason. They can have mystical experiences. In fact, we'll talk about that a bit. I've scanned people who were in the middle of a mystical experience, and they tend to activate their non-dominant, or usually the right temporal lobe. For example, I was on the Oz show, and we scanned Teresa Caputo baseline, and then when she was channeling the dead, so I think it's pretty interesting, and activated her right lateral temporal lobe. So spiritual experience, mysticism can be involved with almost like an epileptic phenomenon, or it can be natural. I mean, 70% of the world believes in spiritual experiences, but if God's going to talk to you, there's going to be a brain mechanism to make that happen. Here is, so again, we're looking underneath the brain. Top is the front part of the brain, bottom is the back. It's one of my patients who was a dentist who was rear-ended outside of Oakland, California. So she's in her little Volvo, an 18-wheel truck rear ends her. Her head actually never hits anything. So it's an interesting question is, can you have a bad brain injury without your head ever hitting anything? And the answer is, well, of course you can. Imagine a baby. Take the baby and shake the baby. Well, what's going on inside the baby's brain? Its baby's brain is slamming up against these sharp ridges in the skull. And if you take the temporal lobe inside the temporal fossa, slam it. So now let's take a grown woman who's bright, who's employed, who's married, and put her in a car and have an 18-wheel truck slam into her. And even though, because of the airbag, her head never hits anything, what is going on? What are the forces going on inside her skull? And her temporal lobe is slamming up against the bones that temporal lobe compared to the right side. Her left temporal lobe is clearly smushed. Her frontal lobes have these big holes in them as well. And when she tried to go back to work, she didn't remember things. She had temper problems. She'd throw things. She just was very ineffective. And when she told the insurance company about these symptoms, they basically said she was faking. And if you look at the scan, she's obviously not faking. But my problem with the insurance company is they traumatized her again. So she's traumatized once by the accident and the loss of function, and then traumatized again by basically being called a malingerer or faker. And I think won nearly a $2 million lawsuit against the insurance company. This is the little boy I told you about, the tooth fairy story, where you can see at the top middle of that left scan, his cingulate is overactive. So when he got the thought in his head he wanted to pull his teeth out, he did. But you can also see, and this is on the left side, his left temporal lobe has this area, or these areas, of significantly increased activity, which is associated with epilepsy. And on a combination of the right medications and supplements, he did so much better. One of my favorite patients, actually, who had really bad temper problems and was having marital problems, when you look at the underside of his scan, you can see his temporal lobes don't look good, his frontal lobes don't look good, which means they're really low in blood flow. And he was a mess when I first started to see him. But then over time, as his brain got better, he was significantly better. His mood was more stable. His work was more consistent. His marriage was better. And, we'll talk about this more in a couple of lessons. But if your brain's not right, your relationships tend not to be right either. What we see in Alzheimer's disease is bilateral, parietal, top back part of your brain, bilateral temporal decreases. And the problem is it starts in your brain decades before you have any symptoms. So this is a scan of Kip Kinkle. Kip Kinkle was a